No, we're starting three.
Are we,
We
do
jumped
you want to
one.
cover a little bit of history? History of the TS. We skipped chapter 2.
Yes, we did.
But did you want me to cover a little bit of that? Just a
Sure.
synopsis?
Sure.
I'm actually going to give the,
Yeah.
not the story that's in here, but the behind the scenes story.
Okay. I would.
Okay.
That would be wonderful. Yeah. Okay. Let's. All right. So now you have to go back and check again.
I was rereading Blavatsky's book, and boy, she sure bounced around a lot when she was younger. The family would move from one place to another.
Yeah.
Check and make sure this is on. Oh, Sadaka joined.
If I do
All right. Yeah, I like it much better without going through the TS. Too much stress.
I know.
I'm not gonna hold that against you, okay?
Okay. We're not sure if we have audio yet. Let's see. It's 2:30. I know. I'm sorry. We're working out the tech, everyone. Give me just a moment. I know it's 2:30, but I have to make sure the audio is feeding. That's why I have the headphones on. Okay.
Just readers? They're just readers, yeah. But I love them so, but now they're not strong.
Where'd you get
You
those?
know.
Who knows?
You just wore a pair of similar shirts. Oh,
Different
different color,
colors.
yeah. Tie-dye stuff, huh?
Yeah.
With the different color, stems.
Oh.
Yeah, see, I can't read it to see what strength it is, but
Oh.
I know more
Oh,
than
look at that. It's
250.
yours look good too. Very nice. I have never seen that. That's been a while back.
Oh, yeah. My sister actually, I know what she got. So cute. She sent me 6 pair, but this was 4 or 5 years ago, all same shade,
Really good.
but like this is the golden blue.
Oh, it comes
silver,
probably in
they're
a,
all different colors.
yeah.
And so, I've been using them. Now this is the last pair I have that is any good, but now it's not strong enough.
Those are Wayfarers.
Yeah, I tried that.
Wayfarers, that's the Wayfarers, yeah.
Shape is way
I think
fair.
we're ready.
Oh, they're awesome.
Does Eugene know about it?
Yeah, I told him that. Hopefully he'll sign up.
Yeah.
I reminded Rhonda also.
Okay.
Actually, she asked about it this morning.
Oh.
So there.
Yeah,
Okay.
Bill too.
So we are expecting a couple of more people that might come in a few minutes late, but they'll be okay, no problem. All right, it's 2:32. Welcome everyone. Glad to see all of you guys back. Mom and Ivan are over there. Ivan, I hope our friend Jillian's going to be able to come back. She's been busy with work, yeah?
Yeah, she has been. She really wants to come back.
She messaged me.
Difficult, yeah.
Good thing these are going to be online, so it's cool that she can still watch later.
Yes.
We have a couple people online as well. All right, let's start off with just an opening meditation, just to calm ourselves down, tune up our vibes, and attune ourselves to studying spiritual material. So let's just get comfortable, tall spine, relaxed shoulders. Feel free to join in an Om. Inhale. Om. Just notice your breath slowly going into the body and slowly exiting the body. As the the easiest thing to focus on to keep the mind still. Allow your thoughts to be brought into the room. Whatever's outside of the room will be there when we're done. Preparing to study spiritual material. Inhale. Okay. And we'll come back. I heard some people come in. Come on in. Hey, good to see you. Hey, Jody, good to see you too. Who'd you bring?
Lynn.
Hey, what's going on? Hi.
That's not bad, man.
We've met before. Good to see you. All right, a couple chairs, right? Oh, Jody, you got to come up front. Come on. Come on. No hiding in the back. This is my dear friend Terry, and that's Roger. This is Jody.
And that's Lynn. The reason I know your name is Lynn is because my name is Roger Lynn.
Oh. Okay. So Jody and Lynn, we do these meetings every other weekend on Sunday, and we're studying something called theosophy. And theosophy is basically the theory behind a lot of yoga philosophy. And there's a book that we have here that we're going through chapter by chapter, and they're available there if you're interested, or not. You just come and hang out and listen and see if anything sounds cool or not. So that's why we do this. We meet and talk about how life works. That's basically what the foundation of theosophy and yoga philosophy provides. How does life work? How can we live life better? Let's see. So this meeting is focused around chapter 3. And as we've done for the first 2 sessions, I've opened up with a quote from a famous author, and I'm going to continue that trend, opening up with a quote from a couple of famous authors named Terry Hunt and Paul Benedict. Okay. So chapter 3 is about universal brotherhood and what that entails and how do we use that to help eliminate suffering in our lives. So here is a nice little quote. What? Go ahead. Yeah. Okay. Okay. This is from the last chapter of our book called Ancient Wisdom for a New Age. The 2 portals. When an enlightened being reaches the level of consciousness which is the goal for our current group of souls, 2 portals appear before him. One leads to nirvana and eternal rest. This is the right of those who have achieved such stupendous heights. The other portal leads to the path of renunciation. The enlightened one who enters here has renounced nirvana and has chosen to remain behind until all his brothers are safe. Compassion speaks and saith, "Can there be bliss when all that lives must suffer? Shalt thou be saved and hear the whole world cry?" This path of renunciation is the path chosen by the Buddha and the Lord Christ. They have vowed not to enter this state of rest until all humanity has been given every possible chance to achieve the same state of enlightenment that they have. Not all who achieve that level of consciousness will choose the portal of renunciation. Those who do are called nirmanakayas. They have renounced the bliss of nirvana in order to help others. It is an enormous sacrifice they make, and one for which we can be eternally grateful. We who have not yet reached the point where that decision looms before us can still decide whether whether we are only interested in achieving enlightenment for ourselves or whether we will use our time and energy to help those around us. Okay, so this is a grand, wide-angle view of what happens at the end of our journey as human beings. So after eons and eons and eons of living in human bodies on this physical world, there's a choice at the end. Do we want to renounce what comes next, the bliss of nirvana, or do we want to come back, take a physical form, and serve as a helper, as an assistant to the rest of humanity, and assist? So this is the choice that will be in front of all of us. And some of us are choosing to be teachers now, some of us are learning now. As a matter of fact, that's not entirely true. Every single human being is a teacher. And every single human being is a student. The most wise teachers you can think of, I just named two of them, the Buddha and the Lord Jesus Christ, are also students. Why? Because the path of evolution and enlightenment doesn't end there. As brilliant and compassionate and as evolved as those two beings are, that's not the end. There's more. So even they are students. Okay. So this chapter 3 is about this idea of universal brotherhood. So we've kind of been inching along in this book here. The first meeting we did, the first meeting we did the sort of the first chapter, and then the second meeting we did more of the first chapter, and then we've been intending to jump ahead to this idea of brotherhood. But now that we have this brilliant mind next to me, we're going to back up again and recap something that we didn't even get to last meeting. And that's just a little bit about the Theosophical Society and where this particular book comes from, and a lot of the material comes from that we study and read in this particular group. So will you give us this time?
Okay. So the question is, how is it that we have the Theosophical Society and the teachings known as Theosophy at this particular point in history? I want to recap the three objects of the society on the wall there, and I'll read them here. One is to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. Second is to encourage the comparative study of religion, philosophy, and science. They're all three types of studies that try to understand how the world operates and how human beings evolve, or how human beings operate. And third is to investigate unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in humanity. That one is a little bit more abstruse, but let's see if I can and we can explain it a little bit. We've mentioned several times the masters, or the elder brothers, as they're sometimes called. Elder brothers meaning people who are in advance of us and from whom we can learn. They have several groups around the world. I don't know how many, and they're not very open about how they operate, and for very good reason. They don't want to be discovered. They want to help people, but they don't want people trying to find them physically, etc., etc. So they help from behind the scenes, and that's the easiest way. We human beings tend to latch on to anything that we find attractive, and whether we realize it or not, for those who are much more advanced, that's actually a huge disadvantage. We think that it's our personal right, but they don't think that way. So they have always existed from the beginning of this Earth and this planetary system. There have been beings much more advanced, far more advanced than we can even imagine, who oversee things. Now, they don't get involved in the minuscule aspects of our everyday lives. That's not their purpose. Nature works perfectly fine without that micromanagement. It evolves and mistakes get made and they get corrected, and it continues to evolve, and it makes its way forward very, very slowly, but always in an evolutionary manner. So at one point, this brotherhood of adepts decided that they thought perhaps the world was ready to learn at least some of the teachings that they knew, that they had been taught. And obviously it would be the very basic part of that. So they needed someone that could convey that. They needed someone that they could teach to communicate with them in the outer world, and that they could transmit teachings. And this person would, of course, have to be evolved enough that they could understand and transmit the teachings to others. So they searched apparently for about 100 years.
300.
Okay, well, 300, 100, a long time. They searched for a long time and waited for someone that they felt would be an adequate conduit for these teachings. And finally, in, let's see, around 1851, approximately, they decided that there was a person in incarnation at the time that might be a candidate, and her name was Helena Blavatsky. She was born in Russia in 1831 and was clairvoyant and naturally psychic from early childhood. She came from a well-to-do and a well-known family. Her grandmother was a princess, and her mother even became a well-known writer in Russia. She was most of you don't know who George Sand is, a French writer, but she was known as the George Sand of Russia. So she was raised, she never went to school. She had private tutors when she was younger, never went to a university, and yet she learned to speak French fluently. She learned Arabic to some extent. She learned English, although her English wasn't very good at first. And she knew some Italian as well. So when she was 20 years old, she was in London, and there was a huge celebration at the time, and there were contingencies that came from all parts of the world, including a contingency of princes from India. And she was present at one of those, and when she was watching, there was one that was extremely tall, and they were riding horses in this kind of a parade. And she recognized him from her meditations or her contemplation. She knew she knew him somehow. And she started to go towards him, and he motioned her back. And so she stood back. But then the next day she was in Hyde Park, and she saw him there, and they had a long discussion. And he explained what it was that they were trying to accomplish, and asked if she was willing to make the sacrifices that would be required in order to be their conduit, their spokesperson. And it was completely within her nature. She was a kind, compassionate, very energetic and dynamic individual. And she decided that she absolutely wanted to offer herself for this role. And so at the time, they didn't reveal much more beyond that. And for the next 20 years, she kind of wandered here and there all over the world and eventually ended up in northern India and Tibet, where again she met up with them. And over a period off and on of about 7 years, she would go to various monasteries where these individuals would teach her. And they taught her how to perform certain phenomena. For example, they had to be able to communicate with her psychically when she was in a different country. There were no telephones or iPhones at the time. So basically it was kind of like a psychic fax machine or a psychic cell phone. And they had to teach her how to do that. The only way she could do that was because she had the purity of life to do that. They cannot teach you something like that if you haven't done the preparatory work. This is all part of Raja Yoga. If you haven't done the preparation and the purification, then the amount that you can achieve is limited. So she had to have achieved that in the current and previous lifetimes in order for that to happen. And even then, they still didn't reveal everything that was expected or even hoped for her. It's kind of frustrating, but that's the way they operate. They give you challenges and then they watch sometimes for long periods of time to see how you handle it. And if a person is impatient, you're not going to be a very good student of theirs. So she, in 1873, was in Paris visiting her brother, and she received a communication from her teacher saying that she was to leave the following day and go to America. She had been around the world before, had visited America before, but she was to drop everything and go to America. So she did. She bought a ticket on the ship and sailed to America, to New York City. And when she arrived, she still didn't know what she was supposed to do. So she tried to make a living for herself and eventually met Colonel Olcott, who was in the Civil War. He was actually, his major role came after the war, when he was one of the people assigned to investigate fraud that occurred during the Civil War. He was an attorney. He was given the rank of colonel, and later he was actually one of the 3 people who were assigned to investigate the assassination of President Lincoln. So just like we had the Warren Commission, he was one of the members of the Lincoln Commission. He was well known in New York City as someone who was very dependable and reliable. And he was also interested in spiritualism. So he decided to go up to Vermont one time to investigate a spiritual medium that everyone had been talking about, and he wanted to see whether it was actually real or not. And it was at this event in Vermont that he met Madame Blavatsky, and they happened to strike up a conversation in French. And after that, they became fast friends, and she started teaching him a few of the things that she had learned. And he was completely fascinated with it. They decided to form the Theosophical Society, and they came up with the 3 objects. And all the time, they were receiving bits and pieces of information. He would actually receive notes sometimes. They would just appear on his mirror, or on his writing table. A note would appear, or in a couple of cases, someone would actually appear in person and give him a message. So he was experiencing phenomenal phenomena.
Phenomenal phenomena. There you go.
And at the time, it was not so unusual because of all the spiritualist phenomena that was going on at the time. It turns out that the masters, the adepts, at first tried to use spiritualism as a means of introducing some of these concepts to the world, but it was a complete failure. The spiritualists weren't the least bit interested in the teachings. They were only interested in communicating with dead individuals.
I want to define what we mean by spiritualists.
Oh, well, I'm assuming most people know what spiritualists are. It's a group of people. It's actually a religion that claims to have mediums that communicate with people who are dead. And I actually investigated it for about 7 years to see if there was anything to it, and I had to leave. It actually used to be called necromancy, dealings with the dead. So
We've all heard of seances. That's
yeah,
the kind of thing that-
seances.
And we call them meetings.
Yeah, exactly. So for 7 years, I studied it, and I could not find anything of real value in it. So I left that aside and continued on my path through Theosophy and Raja Yoga. So that's the story behind how the Theosophical Society got started. And are there any questions about any part of that?
No,
Oh, Jerry, go ahead.
I was just noticing, I think we talked, this is off subject a little, but last time we met, we were talking about the number 7. And I'm listening today, and so far it's been said twice, the importance of the number 7. And so like 7 years, and then there was another, so I just wanted to bring that.
Yeah, you'll find that the numbers 3, 7, and 10 are all very important numbers in spiritual studies.
And 12 and 14.
Oh yeah, there are others too. 2 is the what? Well, yeah, 2 is the number that doesn't really apply, because as soon as you have duality, you have a third point, which is the result of the duality. So it goes immediately from 1 to 2 and then into 3. So 2 is kind of meaningless in spiritual studies.
Yeah, I also.
No, you.
Did you do any YouTube videos about it? Okay. I also heard, to just add on to what you were saying, that she was not accepted around the world because she was way more advanced than the average person who was into religiosity and all that. And so they couldn't accept her, and some of them thought that she was a little wacky, doing this woo-woo stuff. So that became for her kind of a thorn in her side. And then people were looking at her like there's something, no, we don't believe her too much. So that's what I had heard.
Well, she didn't pay too much attention to that. Her goal was to be helpful and to do what she had agreed to do. And so it didn't really, she knew that it was not going to be easy. In fact,
she was way ahead of her time.
At the beginning of her mission, so to speak, she said, and now, let's see, how did she put it? I can't remember, but basically she said, okay, now my crucifixion begins, so to speak, because she knew she was going to be lambasted and scorned and mistrusted and
She
misunderstood.
had seances and stuff, and people thought it was.
Well, she didn't really perform any seances, but she could perform phenomena, and she did at first. She was allowed to perform some phenomena at first, thinking that scientific people would be interested and would want to know how it was done, but that ended up being a huge mistake too.
Adding to that point, think of the genesis of any spiritual tradition or religion. At first, the teacher is unknown completely, and then he or she will amass a small group of followers. Think of the 12 apostles. Patanjali was the same way. The guy who wrote the Yoga Sutras, he was just some yoga guru who probably had an ashram of who knows how many, could have been 5, 10, or maybe a couple of hundred. And now these people, Jesus, Patanjali, I'm putting them in the same category, the Buddha, how many hundreds of millions of people follow their teachings? Same thing with HPB. How large is the Theosophical Society? Tens of thousands of people throughout the world are members, and then many more than that are aware of her teachings and study her and follow her. But at the beginning, yes, it's the same.
Remember that any teaching, once it is accepted by a large number of people in the world, has to have devolved down to that level. It's only the upper echelon that will be attracted, will be able to recognize it, and will be willing to dedicate whatever effort it takes to live those teachings. So it's always going to be a small number at the top, and then eventually it all trickles down, but it's a very, very long process.
Excuse me, I might have missed this when you were talking, but when she saw someone on the horse and recognized him, who is he?
Oh, it was her teacher. We don't know what his real name was because they all use pseudonyms, but he called himself Moria,
Oh, I know Maury.
or just or just the.
That's good. That was
letter
M.
So,
did he belong to, was he an adept?
Yes, he ended up being one of the two main adepts that were the overseers for the Theosophical Society. So in the beginning, they weren't the ones that communicated the most. In the beginning, there were members of the Brotherhood in Egypt, the Brotherhood of Luxor. Those are the ones that were writing the notes to Olcott, and he would get messages from them. But before too long, it kind of switched over to the Brotherhood in Tibet. And then Moria and Kutumi were the two that took the main interest in it.
And these brotherhoods, they're all adepts?
Yes. And they all work together, but we know 3 at least. The one that was in Tibet, which I don't know, maybe in North India, I don't know where it is today. They don't say anything. There was the one in Luxor in Egypt. I don't know if it's still there. There was one in the Yucatan. And those are the only 3 that I'm aware of that actually had physical locations, but they all work together. They're not at all, different in their goals. They just happen to be in different parts of the world, and they all work as one unit, one brotherhood. But brotherhood, thus, is the #1 concept of theosophy. If brotherhood doesn't mean anything to you, then theosophy won't really mean anything to you. Over to you.
Let me make one comment. Moria, whenever he was talking about Blavatsky, he always called her the old lady. And he kept her alive for a lot longer than she probably would have liked to have been because he kept pushing her and pushing her. So.
Well, she agreed to it, though. He gave her the choice.
Sexist language.
Actually, you bring up a good point here. The adepts have very good senses of humor. They don't take themselves as seriously as some of the people we know who have huge egos do. And that's actually very important. HPB, for example, would refer to her teacher as boss. My boss told me that I should do this. And Alcott would call them the boys sometimes. They would think that was, not a very nice comment, but they weren't put off by it because it wasn't meant in a rude fashion. They was just they actually have a really good sense of humor and aren't above a good joke.
Were the adepts ascended masters?
Well,
Or
there's
were
a
the
group.
main warrior?
There's a group later that decided that they were going to reinvent them, so to speak, and they added this term "ascended" to it, and you have to study it carefully, but it's again bringing them down into a different realm.
Both terms are referring to the same beings, though, the same individuals.
Go ahead.
Brotherhood. So I think it's brother. So it is interesting to note that we have meditation, we have seances, we have all this psychic powers, and yet the most important piece to all of this is this idea of unity and brotherhood. Why do we think that is? Why is the brotherhood of humanity more important, says the Theosophical Society, than learning to meditate, learning to calm the mind, learning the constitution of man? Why do we think brotherhood is so important and emphasized so much? Any ideas?
Evolution of,
Okay,
what's the word? Evolution of enlightenment.
that's certainly part of it, yes.
One thing that's kind of interesting that we in the Western world probably don't think of very often is that not everybody, not all races and not all ethnic groups think the same way we do. We're very individualistic. We're very much focused on our personal individual rights. And there are many countries and many ethnic groups where that's almost totally meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
They are much more about family, about ethnic group, about the group. Everything is done as a group and not so much as individuals. So that's part of our nature of the race and the type of environment that we grew up in. And it's actually supposed to be that way. We'll learn later about the different races. And we're not talking about physical races, but about spiritual races. And one of the most recent ones has to do with the mind and developing the mind. And that's the one that has the most focus on the individual. So brotherhood means different things to different people. One thing almost at the very beginning of the Bible, remember the story of Cain and Abel. And what did God say after Abel or Cain killed his brother? What did he say?
See what you did?
He said,
Rubbed his nose in it.
he said, where's your brother? And what did he answer? What? Am I my brother's keeper?
Oh, right.
Am I my brother's keeper? I don't know. So brotherhood starts off very early on in the Bible as being a concept of whether or not we are our brother's keeper.
The first question in the questions to ponder that I emailed out asks us to explain what is meant by the immanence of God. And now, remember, we didn't give the disclaimer like we normally do at the beginning of class, but nothing we say is doctrine or dogma, and you don't have to believe anything we say. Just hear what we say, and if something makes sense, then you can apply it and use it. But the word God can mean 7 billion things, one for each of the human beings on earth. God can mean something different to everyone. So when we ask what is meant by the immanence of God, this is the answer to the question of why brotherhood is the first object of the Theosophical Society. Well, if you believe, or if you feel, if you know that we are all expressions of the same energetic impulse, the same conscious mind, the same universal, all-penetrating life, then that is the answer to the question why brotherhood is so important. Because we are all of the same nature. We are all of the same life in the first place. And as Terry just mentioned a moment ago, our society, the Western world, is the most individualistic. Is that a word? I just made up an individualistic. Individualistic. Yeah. Most separate, most perceived separate society that is alive on the planet today. We think that Jody is a completely separate thing from me. Well, of course, the physical body is different. She has a different physical form on this plane. But at the other levels of existence, it's not so separate. And as we learn about our true constitution, what makes up a human being, we'll realize that only the physical form appears to be separate. All the other 6 levels of ourselves, which Theosophy teaches, and it's coming in subsequent if we ever make it past the 3rd chapter, we'll learn about the different levels of existence. There is not such the separation that we perceive. So the immanence of God means that every life form is an expression of God, is a form, an outward form of the same thing. So if you don't believe that other life forms are connected to you, then brotherhood wouldn't make sense to you. So that's why it's the first and foremost importance in the society to understand that we're all part of the same life, the same being.
And going back to the power of one, if you are mean to your brother or your sister, you're mean to yourself. So always be good to everyone.
Right.
No,
That's very true.
That actually brings up another saying from the Bible, where Jesus says that we are to love our brother, our neighbor, love our neighbor as ourselves. Most people interpret that as loving him as much as we love ourselves. But we can also interpret that as loving our neighbor because he is ourself.
Right.
It's like somebody was commending a person who had given something to a homeless person, and said, "Oh, that was really kind of you." And he says, "No," he said, "I was just giving it to myself." So, if your neighbor is yourself, then of course you share everything, you help, you do whatever you can.
Now, let's address this idea of masculinity in the term brotherhood. I know you were half joking, but let's address that. Why is it
have sisterhood?
Of course. I mean, there are more women
in
on the world than there are men. I think it's 51% to 49. Right?
Women's studies.
Okay. So it most certainly does not imply masculinity. Because if you finish reading the first object, it's to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood without distinction of sex. So it's just kind of an older fashioned word that's been used to describe family. So brotherhood, family, or more accurately, spiritual siblinghood. So it's certainly not just brothers. It's all
siblinghood doesn't roll off the tongue.
It's like individualistic.
Because women's studies, what's going on in today's world, in terms of sexist language, feminists of today are trying to do away with.
Right.
The feminist and the feminine and the masculine language.
It would be nice if we had that in our language, but historically we don't have it in English. And some languages are even worse. For example, in Spanish, if you talk about my parents, you don't say my parents, you say my fathers. My fathers. And if you talk about the king and the queen, you don't say the king and queen, you say the kings.
Or God being masculine.
Plural. So,
God being masculine.
yeah, exactly. So I wish and eventually we probably will
We are,
adopt terms. So
we are.
it all changes.
Well, in a lot of the yoga traditions, they have the idea of divine mother. Instead of God being this idea of a man in the clouds, it's the divine mother, and they're moving towards maternalistic oversight.
But from the very beginning, like Paul pointed out in the first object, that it was without regard to race, caste, sex, creed, color. And this was very progressive in 1875. They still had men's clubs and
Still have those.
Yeah, and only white people were allowed to join them, and they were very restrictive. And that lasted up through the 1960s and even beyond. So there were lots of exclusive clubs, but Theosophy was not one of those. It from the beginning was like, you know what? We're all one. We're all equal, and get used to it.
Approaching the idea of this family of all human beings, spiritual family of humanity, science will tell us that all human beings, no matter what race or color or age or anything they are, our DNA is almost 100% similar. All humans. So that shows right there that we are part of the same group of life forms. And it's also important to note that the Theosophical Society does not claim to form the brotherhood, to form the brotherhood of humanity. It claims to form a nucleus, a focal point of it, and not the only one. So the word "a" is very important. Theosophy never claims to have all the answers or to be the only focal point and center, spiritual center, so to speak, of the brotherhood of humanity, but it's one. So it's very open-minded to foster the knowing implications among humans. And then some other nuclei of the brotherhood of humanity might be religious groups, other metaphysical groups, humanitarian groups. There are many groups that foster this idea of brotherhood. Theosophy is just one option. Okay, so there are 3 sections in this chapter on brotherhood. Brotherhood in terms of the one life or the divine, brotherhood as it relates to the evolution of consciousness, and brotherhood as it relates to the path. Now, for those of us that are new to Theosophy, this term of the path might not be readily apparent, but there is a spiritual path that we are all walking, and that's a foundational concept in the Yoga Sutras and in Theosophy. So we'll talk about brotherhood in light of each of these 3 categories here. So,
and just to point out, the path is not a road that's well demarcated that you
graded and
go from here to here to here. There's actually a Spanish writer who said, "Pilgrim, there is no path. You make the path as you go." That's the path. Each individual makes his or her own path.
No steps.
And the same path doesn't work for everyone.
And
you have to figure out how you make it work and which path is yours.
And then we're handed a machete.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's kind of how it works.
Yeah.
Or we have to make a machete. More like it, we have to
Yeah.
make a machete and cut the vines in front of us and find the path. And yet at some point, the path does become more clear. And that's exactly what we're studying here, how to find the damn path, how to see the path, how to rise above the vines and the weeds and the trees so we can see, okay, that path goes that way, that one goes that way. Which path do I want to walk on? Yeah, and that's the study that we're doing. We're understanding how the trees grow in life so we can see, okay, there's a better way around this one. And that's really the tactical steps in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali.
But wouldn't that be like the journey? Yeah, my path is my journey.
Mhm.
And I will wind up with the brotherhood, so to speak,
Hopefully.
right?
Mhm.
No, not hopefully.
And keep in mind,
Or you in particular, yeah.
remember how I said that they don't give you lots of information, but they can see if they choose to. They know exactly where you are and they can see what you're struggling with. And they don't make it easier for you because the struggle is the important part. You have to figure it out.
Good information.
If they gave you all the answers, then you wouldn't have the fortitude or the strength.
No. good answers. When I meditate, my guides give me a lot of information. They're just very sparse on the detail. So, you have to.
So I'm a little bit confused on the they. Who are the they?
Well-
Is this spirit or is this a group in 3 places?
No, I'm talking about real individuals, and most of them, many of them do have physical bodies, and not all of them do. But they interact with the physical world and with individuals in the physical world. But more often than not, they are way behind the scenes, and they don't even make themselves known most of the time. So and there's a whole hierarchy. There are some that are only slightly more advanced than you are, but there are others that are far more advanced that we can't even imagine what their life is like.
Are they the ones that chose to come
Stay.
to stay? No, come back. No, stay.
No, this is even way beyond that.
Way beyond that.
Way beyond that. We're talking about an intermediate level.
Okay.
We're down here somewhere. The adepts, the teachers are up here, and then the Nirmanakayas are way beyond that.
In terms of levels.
Yes.
I have a question about the term nirvanics. Nirvanas.
Well,
The people who
nirvana.
have chosen nirvana.
Mhm.
What do they do? Do we know?
Well, if you choose to go into nirvana, it's a state of bliss. It's
And it doesn't help.
we'll learn later in a different chapter about something at a much lower level called devachan, which is also a state of bliss after a person dies. But it's basically they've earned that right. They have earned the right to spend eons of time in a state of bliss before they come out of it and continue their journey. So it's a reward. But
It's
you
also
can
a state of
renounce it.
rest. It's also a state of rest before another cycle.
So you don't stay there like
Forever.
eternity.
No,
Okay.
but it's a very long
You're
time.
using words. Is this yogi language, or what? You used a term. Where is that term coming from?
Which term?
The level or something?
Nirmanakaya is
Yeah, Nirmanakaya.
the beings that renounce nirvana
Yeah.
who stay. Would it be Vedantic or
Let's see,
Theosophical?
Nirvana.
Are they-
Nirvana is Buddhist, isn't it?
Buddhist?
Might be Buddhist.
Yes. What is the term in Vedanta? It is
Moksha?
Moksha. Yeah, moksha and nirvana are similar
So
terms. but
moksha would be more yogic in nature.
Oh.
Nirvana would be more
Buddhist,
Buddhist.
So some of these beings are physical and some are spirit.
super physical. Yes.
A couple more notes on this idea of the immanence of God, God manifesting through all. There's a little quote from our book: "From microbe to megagalaxy, from atom to angel, the universe is an expression of the divine reality by whatever names that reality may be called. It's much deeper than humanistic ideals of kindness and consideration. It's an integral part of our existence, period." So Terry was mentioning the idea of pain and suffering and fighting, and this idea of suffering is a result of karma, and there's a large scale epidemic of suffering on the planet. There's always been, and it's going to happen until everyone understands universal brotherhood and realizes, if I go to war against you, I'm hurting myself. We can boil that down to arguments and just altercations with a spouse or with a coworker. Same kind of thing. We're forgetting about brotherhood. We're forgetting that we're all part of the same energy, the same life. It's that Pee Wee Herman thing. Whenever I throw it, I bounce it. I'm rubber, you're glue, or you're rubber. How does that go?
I don't know.
Whatever
I guess
bounces
it
off of you and
just
sticks to
comes
me.
back.
Yeah, exactly.
The law of cause and effect.
There you go.
Are we going to?
Are we going to
Will
what?
Jesus return? My mind is just kind of
Yeah.
everywhere, but
Are we going to what?
you said until we all
Oh,
get that, and that I can understand.
Well, that's if you are practicing something called Ishvara Pranidhana, which is a yogic term. And if you resign yourself to the idea that there is a plan and there is a purpose, well, then it's inevitable. Then yes. But of course, that's not it. You're not required to believe that. It could be completely chance, chaotic.
We may be here for another 50,000 billion more years.
We probably
have
will
all
be.
the time we need.
Yeah.
It's taking a long time for people on the planet to understand.
It's up to us.
I know.
But that is a good segue into the next section, which is brotherhood in light of evolution.
Right.
And as we mentioned last class, we're talking about two different kinds of evolution: Darwinian evolution, which talks about the physical forms of life, and spiritual evolution, which Theosophy talks about the evolution of our awareness and consciousness. And they happen side by side. As consciousness grows in awareness and experience is gained, the consciousness needs more evolved forms to operate through. So Darwin got half of it right, and then the Theosophists and the yogis got the other half. So put them together and they go side by side. And over 50 billions of millions of years, it happens, but it's very slow, very, very slow. So, sure, right. We can see how it is progressing, though. There's evidence. There's a lot of evidence that it is happening. But when we are in the weeds or in the forest, the jungle, when we lost our machete, it's impossible to see the grand picture. And that's when we suffer so much. Oh, I'm never going to get out of this. When is it going to end? This is my last lifetime on earth. I know it is. After this, I'm going to nirvana. It's that kind of idea that the people who are down in the muck say. But when you begin to view the whole thing from a higher perspective and meditate and see things without the emotional cloud in front of us, then we realize that, yeah, something is happening here. I can walk this path and be part of this evolution, or I can fight against it. So let's talk about what the evidence is for this evolution of the knowingness of brotherhood. Think about an infant. What kind of interests does the infant have? Not very many. What are some interests that an infant would have?
Food, sleep,
Food, sleep,
hunger,
Maslow's theory.
physical.
Yeah.
and it's
tactile,
tactile, right? Comfort, and it's all about himself or herself. Okay. Now think about what happens when an infant starts to grow up a little bit. Kindergarten, 5 years old, they learn how to share with others.
Hopefully.
Some, hopefully. Teenagers,
Still
high school, learn how to form groups. I know, still, of course, but it's a process, right? Form groups. What about running for student council? So maybe some more altruistic types of activities, joining team sports. Interests are no longer food, feed me, wham, sad, crying. It's more sort of learning how to share, learning how to work with a team, eventually having a family of their own, perhaps, maybe joining a church or joining a group that helps serve the homeless, for example. So the interests of a human being it's like a fractal. It's a microcosm of the macrocosm. So if you take that evolution we just described of its interest moving from selfish only to altruistic somewhat in a human's life, let's look at early humans, Neanderthals, for example. If the male Neanderthal wants to mate with a female, he whacks her over the head and drags her back to the cave. It's all selfish. He doesn't care about her well-being. I'm not pointing at you. I'm going to whack Jody and take her back to my cave. So that's a Neanderthal's mindset. So now human beings don't do that anymore, right?
We
They
still
learn
have
some.
some. We still have some.
Roger doesn't.
Think about primitive tribes who used to eat other humans. That's almost not done anymore. Right. And how much more popular is veganism now than it was in 1875? If you walked into a restaurant in 1875 and said, I'm gluten intolerant, who are you? They'll probably shoot you or something. or lactose intolerant. So the idea of brotherhood, these are some ideas. Let's look at, okay, I just lost my train of thought. Clan, community, race, ourselves, family. Ahimsa.
Well, it extends not just to other humans, but to animals, plants even.
Of course.
And to our planet, even to minerals. You know, do we rape and plunder the planet, or do we act as responsible stewards and take care of it and practice conservation and ecological awareness? Yes.
I remember what I was going to say. Slavery. Let's talk about that for a second. So here's another piece of evidence. So not too long ago, it was completely acceptable to own slaves. Completely acceptable. And to treat them however the owner of another human wanted to treat them. That wasn't the
They
norm.
were property.
Property. Human
As
being
were
owning another
women
human.
and children were property.
So see how that's progressed. And then at some point there was concern over how the slaves were being treated. So that's a baby step, right? Oh, well, you can own a human, but just don't treat them poorly. So that a baby step, right? That's a slow expansion of consciousness on this evolutionary path. And now what do we see around the globe? That it's mostly outlawed, but not 100%. It's still practiced. And even in countries where it is outlawed, it's still done. So
Including America.
Including America, for sure. Terry was mentioning the other life forms. So it's this idea of brotherhood doesn't actually stop at the human kingdom. There's other life on the planet besides humans. So obviously there are animals, and obviously there are plants, trees, and rainforests and things. There's more than that, though. In the theosophical view, there isn't any dead matter. No matter doesn't have life in it. It's just not a type of life that current science recognizes. So the planet itself, we touched on this in the last class, the idea that the planet has a life energy in it, rocks and minerals. So I love how this book refers to human beings as the elder brothers or elder sisters or siblings of the lower kingdoms. Now, not necessarily lower in terms of any less... Yeah, any status. It's just evolution, right? So the consciousness of animals and plants, generally speaking, isn't as expanded as the consciousness that is in a human being, generally speaking, right? Some animals are very evolved, are better than some, are more smart than some humans. Yeah, of course.
But here's the thing. All forms of life have within it the instinct to survive.
Mhm.
And herein lies maybe the problem. Because if there's an instinct to survive, that instinct at its low, I don't know, we call it sometimes a low level, right? Our lower nature instinct. But on the other hand, in order to survive, one has to be aware of being something's coming at me, that flight or fight kind of thing. If it's in all forms of life, and we are trying to become more aware and from a higher consciousness. This is why we're always in a battle with our body, with our lower form. We can't get away from that instinct. So what do you think about that? What do you think about that instinct that propels us? Either sexually it propels us, or it propels us to run or to hide. But it's not a higher form of consciousness.
Well,
That's
I
right.
think you answered the question yourself.
Myself.
And that is, let me just point it out. At first you were talking about my survival, and then you're talking about survival of the species.
I mean of every living form in the
But
universe.
you keep expanding that. That's the consciousness. As the consciousness expands, you realize that everything is a part of me. So if I'm to survive, I need to make sure that everything else survives as well. So it's simply an awareness that continues to grow.
And it
So
starts
that
off being
instinct.
unconscious, which is the instinct part.
Yeah.
It ends up being conscious, which is
Yeah,
more of
yeah,
an intuitive.
That's right.
Yeah.
The old id, yeah.
The old id. At it again.
This is a great point to talk about a couple of yogic concepts, because after all, this is called a Theosophy and Yoga webinar. So this discussion here ties very well into a foundational yogic concept called ahimsa. Anyone heard of that term before?
Ahimsa.
Ahimsa. So in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali outlines an 8-fold path towards samadhi. Samadhi is union with your higher self, transcendence from the physical, which is achieved through meditation and through the foundational preparatory stages. So there are eight limbs. Ashtanga means 8 limbs. And so Raja Yoga is also known as Ashtanga Yoga. And one of the limbs has to do with purification of the physical vehicle and moral ethical requirements. And one of the moral ethical requirements is ahimsa. So one of our favorite authors is this guy, I.K. Taimni, who was a theosophist who wrote a commentary on the Yoga Sutras. And I want to read a couple things. So ahimsa generally translates into non-harm or no harming. Far more than just your fellow human, but everything that we're talking about here, the other kingdoms of life and the planet itself. And he says ahimsa really denotates an attitude and mode of behavior towards all living creatures based on the recognition of the underlying unity of life. A yogic philosophy is based on the doctrine of the one life. It is easy to see why our outer behavior should be made to conform to this all-embracing law of life. If we understand this principle thoroughly, the application of the ideal in our life will become much easier. And he goes on to say, the correct insight into right action under every set of circumstances is the result of a developed and purified buddhi, or intuition. This is the evolution of the instinct, the next level up. And this function of buddhi, or intuition, unhindered by the complexes in our mind, is possible only after prolonged training in doing the right thing at all costs. So in yogic terminology, non-harm to other life forms at all costs is absolutely required on this path that we're walking. That's a tactical guide or key for us. If we want to eliminate some suffering in our lives and further this idea of recognizing brotherhood, we have to first practice ahimsa ourselves. We can't force everyone else to do. We can't go into the Middle East and tell Syria and the other neighboring countries we have to start doing it ourselves. And then it just happens magically. God sprinkles magic dust on everybody.
Yeah, and then it ripples out, but it takes 3 million years.
Yeah, exactly.
No, it does take a long time.
Can I just ask something that may be a little off subject right now? So all this wonderful evolution that we're all proposing and doing and experiencing, ultimately, what is the goal?
That's a very, very good question.
In the end, I mean, is the universe going to?
Well, in one word, the goal is enlightenment, but enlightenment is not a final destination. It's a path. It's onward expansion of consciousness and awareness and higher and higher experience. It never ends. Hopefully, if it ever ended, then what would happen?
Right.
Goes on and on.
As far as anyone can tell, it just goes on forever. And that would make sense to me.
Are you perhaps asking that because it conflicts with the idea of heaven in Christianity?
I'm just wondering if, once we achieve heaven, nirvana, is that we're just in a state of bliss? Everybody, everything?
It's a state of bliss, but at some point it becomes boring.
Right.
You know, you rest at night because you're tired, you're worn out. But by the next morning, you don't want to stay in bed for another 24 hours, at least usually. You're like, okay, I'm re-energized. I need to go do something. And it's the same with nirvana or with Devachan or anything else. Paul mentioned earlier that everything that happens in the macrocosm happens in the microcosm at a different level. So every day we have a period of rest. Every lifetime we have a period of rest at the end of that lifetime. Every time we make a major advancement in our spiritual progress, there is a period of rest and repose because it takes a tremendous amount of work and effort. And there is a reward. That reward is peace and bliss. But at some point, there's something something reawakens within you and says, okay, I'm re-energized now. Let's go do some more. And that's exactly how it works.
But ultimately, we go back to being the soul. And the soul is.
Well, the soul
one
is
with-
the soul is actually just an intermediate step. That's our higher nature of us as human beings.
We're talking
We're
huge
talking
time scales
about
now, though.
Far,
Huge.
far beyond that. So far, we can't
You mean
even
God?
imagine.
The thing is, we don't know.
Exactly.
We don't know exactly.
We are
All we
given
know
clues.
is the general concept. That's what we know is the concept.
Okay, so is it possibly to be godlike?
Yes, absolutely. But we have to know what God is. You and I might define God differently. I would define God as, for example, maybe the individual, the entity that is in charge of a planetary system, maybe, or maybe a galaxy. Each one has different functions, and they both can coexist at the same time. See, in theosophical
there's more than
terms,
one God.
all of us at some point will be considered some kind of a God. What that is, I may not be able to define it very well right now, but it will be something far beyond what I've achieved so far. So far, I've achieved humanity, the consciousness that defines me as a human being. But when that consciousness expands and grows to a certain extent, it could possibly be interpreted as a godlike. But with that expansion of consciousness comes far more responsibility than I could possibly even conceive of now.
This conversation exactly was one of the hooks that got me when I met this guy in 2006 when he was teaching this book. And I was fascinated by this idea. Well, so you're saying someone manages our planetary system, someone manages our galaxy. So what? Well, theosophical literature lays all this out. Now, Terry and I don't teach too much about that because, first of all, humanity doesn't know everything about it. And second of all, here's the key piece. It's not really practical for us. That's why we always teach Raja Yoga, because these are the tactical steps we can use today. How do we eliminate suffering today? Well, if we practice non-attachment to our things, so to us, that is the focus of our teaching, because that can help us now. And yes, it's super fascinating to think about the hierarchy of the spiritual hierarchy of our solar system. I was fascinated and it hooked me, and that's available. The writings in the Theosophical Society talk in detail about these things. What are their titles? Is the Christ a person or is it an office of the spiritual hierarchy? What is the planetary logos? Is the sun an entity? Is the sun in control? Is the sun the physical body of this being who controls our solar system? Is there the same kind of thing for the Milky Way galaxy and then the galactic system? Sure, it's all fascinating.
And it's perception.
And it's not practical at the same time. But it's important. It's important. And so this is the Ishwara Pranidhana that I was saying. If we know that we're part of this system, so Ishwara Pranidhana is a yogic term that means resignation to God, whatever God means, understanding that there is a system. We are a part of a system. That's the key piece.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, we can only understand concepts is far beyond our current comprehension, but we can understand the general flow of progress of how things work. And then we can come down to our everyday life and say, okay, how do I apply that now, today, in my everyday life?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the important part of it.
And this is why they say meditation is the only key, right?
These questions become more clear. Even though we might not have a concrete answer to give in a question and answer situation, when we sit and ponder these things in meditation, things start to coalesce and make sense. And Mom, the book that I showed you, where did that book go? The Yoga of Jesus. It's around here somewhere.
I got it.
Oh, you did. This book talks about that. He says you contact God through meditation.
Yeah.
If we want to know God, you contact him through meditation. Paramahansa Yogananda said that.
But isn't there a common thread? Like when I said perception, I'm sure all of us have been to different forums that have their own perception of spirituality and theosophy, but there's a thread that runs through them that's common with these philosophies. There's brotherhood, there's enlightenment, there are so many things, and people have so many choices. And I believe that those choices, from what I've learned, which is limited, all take us to that place of enlightenment. So
There are many paths.
many paths.
Yes.
One thing I want to point out is that meditation is what allows us to stop this kind of rat race that we're in
Intellectualism.
most of the time,
Yeah.
including in the mind. Eckhart Tolle talks about the voice in the head, and it's usually talking. It allows us, at least for a few moments, to shut that down and raise our consciousness ever so slightly, and just take a pause and then turn around and kind of look from a different perspective. And that is what expansion of consciousness is all about. If you never make that attempt and never make the effort to do that, then you just continue the rat race. And that most people are completely wound up in it until the day they die, and then they finally get some rest. But
Democrat, Republican.
we don't have to wait until that point to take a little bit of time to let it go and rise above it, at least for a short period of time.
So we've got to tie this to some practical stuff now a little bit. So we talked about ahimsa, and now practicing brotherhood has another corollary, or another piece from the Raja Yoga tradition I want to talk about, and that's aparigraha. This is another one of the yamas. So the 8-limbed path has the 8 limbs start off with yama and niyama. Each yama, there are 5 yamas and 5 niyamas, and these roughly correspond to the 10 Commandments in Christianity, roughly, more or less. And all religions have some rules similar to those. So aparigraha, I.K. Taimi says, is sometimes translated as absence of greediness, but non-possessiveness gives the underlying idea better. Non-possessiveness. In order to understand why it is essential for the would-be yogi to eliminate this tendency in his life, we have only to consider the tremendous bias which it gives to our life. The tendency to accumulate worldly goods is so strong that it may be considered almost a basic instinct in human life. So when we're always looking to acquire and accumulate and amass wealth, that is the opposite of brotherhood. That's looking out for ourselves only. That's taking all the resources and hoarding, and it's mine. We're cutting off the trade from other countries. It's what all these tariffs that are going on. He's an example of someone who's not practicing aparigraha, putting the tariffs on the Chinese materials and all that. That's reducing this idea of brotherhood back towards a selfish world. Of course, as long as we live in the physical world, we have to have a few things which are essential to the maintenance of the physical body, although essential and non-essential are relative terms. How big of a house do we need? Exactly. How fast of a car do we need?
A bicycle.
A bicycle and a hut.
We used to say a Kia and a hut.
If you own a Kia and a hut, you might be a yogi. You might be a yogi if you live in a hut and drive a Kia. So he goes on to say, which is very interesting, we do not, however, stop even when we've acquired luxuries. When we have at our disposal all the means that can ensure all possible comforts and enjoyment for the rest of our life, we are still not satisfied and continue to amass wealth. We all can name people like that. They can never be rich. They can never have enough houses, enough palaces, or enough cars.
But it's interesting that they're miserable.
That's what
No
I was
matter
going to
how
say.
much. So you get to decide what is enough. And once you have enough, then you're happy.
Right.
Isn't that true?
That's true. That's exactly.
So
right.
lower your standards maybe a little bit and you'll be happier.
Or appreciate who you are.
Yeah.
Go within to
Exactly.
understand better
The other part of this is, do you enjoy with yourself?
I do.
Okay, good. A lot of people don't. A lot of people have to be with noise and with commotion, with
I
other
like that
people
too.
around them. If you don't enjoy being alone with yourself, then ask yourself, why is that?
Why?
It's important to know why this is a detriment towards enlightenment, on our path towards enlightenment. Why is amassing physical things a detriment? So several reasons. First of all, we spend a lot of our time and energy accumulating things, working, burning the candle at both ends, making as much money as possible to buy as many things as possible. So that's stressful on the psyche alone right there. Then once you accumulate things and acquire things, you have to work to keep them. It's the idea of holding on to them. Once you have the big house and the big car and the title and you don't want to ever lose it.
But then you're also comparing, oh, but she's got more than I do. I've got to work harder now.
Yes.
And that comes in all the time too, comparing yourself to others.
Yeah.
And the realization that nothing lasts forever is a foreign concept to most people who are very physically oriented. Eckhart Tolle has a wonderful quote in his book, and we've been quoting him all day long because he's probably our all-time favorite author.
Yeah.
He has a quote in here in A New Earth: all structures are unstable. All structures are unstable. And what he really means by that is nothing is ever permanent. Nothing. Not even the physical body. It's obvious when you think about it. This only lasts 80, 90 years. If you take care of it, maybe a little bit more. But the physical possessions that we have, they are impermanent. And if we learn that early on, life becomes so much easier. Now, that brings us to the last point on this aparigraha that I want to make. Can a yogi live in a mansion? Can a yogi drive a Rolls Royce? That's a question. No, that's a real question. What do you guys think?
They have.
There's some,
Okay.
several cars.
Now, how do you reconcile this then? How can a yogi have a $300,000 car?
Right, that's just like saying, if I have a choice, like from previous lifetimes, I know that I've pulled in, if I have money, I'm not spiritual. Okay, and I had to relearn that in this lifetime. So to get back to your question about the yogi, I think that if you're on a path and you understand and you amass wealth, but you can stay on your path. There's no reason why you can't, in my mind's eye. So yeah, to
Okay.
that question.
So we have a yes.
Yes.
We have two yeses.
What about
Well,
the millions of people who don't have a place to sleep or enough food to eat?
How do you know he's driving a car and not having housing for, using his money for housing?
That's
We
his
don't
path.
know that.
That's his path.
We're judging already.
We're judging.
We're immediately judging this poor yogi. Who is this guy?
Oh, you want to meet him? No. No, it's a question. So the key piece is the attitude towards the items, towards the physical things, the attitude.
Detachment.
And what would the attitude that the yogi must have towards his physical things is the idea of non-attachment, that he's temporarily a steward of this Rolls Royce. Taken from him through a crash, or if the stock market crashes and he loses his money,
He's fine.
guess what happens inside? Nothing happens.
Nothing.
Nothing happens. Now, that's an extremely tall order. The most enlightened person that I can think of would still have something, a little bit of something that happens, right? But everyone has a degree of something that goes on inside when physical things are taken from them. The idea is perfect equilibrium. That's a sign of a near adept or an adept. If you can have your physical things taken from you and be unflappable, mentally, emotional, at a deep level, sure, you can live in the ridges of Summerlin.
Yeah, that's the emotional attachment.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, how does that correspond to brotherhood? I have no idea. No. It's the idea of being. So the yogi who has all the money,
Yeah.
practically speaking, sure, of course, he's not going to be a selfish rich person. He would be a rich person who's a philanthropist, for example.
Right.
Yes.
But I want to point out too that the yogi, the enlightened person, doesn't obsess about the fact that there is suffering in the world. he or she recognizes that everything is the way it is for a reason. And so what they do is everything possible to help people learn how to raise themselves up. Don't give somebody a fish, teach them how to fish. Teach them how to develop a different attitude, how to see how life works from a higher perspective, so that you can start raising yourself out of this mire of depression and anger and resentment and suffering that so many people are in.
We're still on this section of the evolution of this brotherhood, how we started off as early humans being very selfish, and now we're supposedly becoming more enlightened. And we're talking about examples. There are some other examples of this evolution. There are a few conscious communities around the world. They're not very well known, though. There's one you've heard of utopian visions, or a utopian idea of a community that works on barter and everyone's happy and there's no money. There actually is one that's been operating in Spain. It's called Mondragon, and it's the world's largest worker co-op, where they all own the whole thing, basically. And there are 22,000 people that live there, and they don't have money. Everyone works. So, and there's another one in Abu Dhabi that's called Masdar City. So there are several of these ideas of communities. Now, most of them don't work, and utopian visions usually fail. But they're happening more and more. And if you look back into the dark ages of humanity, they didn't exist at all. So at least people are thinking about these things. And so it's evidence as to the progression. The Burning Man Festival is one. We all know what Burning Man is, right? It's the idea of conscious community and drugs.
I was going to say the 60s all over again.
Very few close.
That's right.
All right, let's talk a little bit about brotherhood and the path in the last 5 minutes that we have. Well, we've actually been talking about the path the entire time. The idea of how do we graduate from the human kingdom at the end when our brothers and sisters are still struggling through life. Well, it has everything to do with compassion. What does compassion mean? Well, it's the sympathetic awareness of others' suffering, coupled with an active desire to help alleviate it. Compassion actually means to suffer together with. And it's a requirement to walk the path, to have this understanding that other people are in trouble and they need us. And then when we're in trouble, we can ask for help as well. There are guides and teachers that have gone before us. We've been talking about these guides, these adepts, places to get assistance and learn from, to make our path easier.
Excuse me, are we aware of these assistants? I mean, through meditation only, or like individually, are we aware?
Aware personally, or have you heard of the Buddha before? Yeah,
No.
that kind of thing.
Of the assistant, of the person that maybe is helping me.
A lot of times you're completely unaware of it. And sometimes in meditation you might be slightly aware of it. It depends on, for different individuals, it's very different.
Are we calling them angels?
No.
No.
No,
We're just calling them entities that have
just teachers.
just teachers.
I just call them teachers.
Yeah.
And
Like you and
most of the time they don't reveal who they are or whatever.
Okay.
This is a hot button topic, though, because people like to know, what lineage they're in. Who's my teacher? Who's my guru? Oh, my guru revealed himself to me through my heart chakra yesterday and gave me this information. And people love talking about that. And this is where non-attachment comes in. Even if you've never been contacted by a spiritual being, you could still be one of the most advanced human beings on earth. Even if you've never once had a divine experience, so to speak. Right, exactly. And that's where one of our other favorite techniques comes in, which is vairagya. That means non-attachment. We can't be attached to this, although we have to keep walking it. And we can't be attached to our progress. Even if you're moving walkways going the opposite way you're walking, you're staying in the same place, it doesn't matter. As long as you're walking.
Making great progress.
I'm doing something here.
Same place I was 20 minutes ago.
Well, at some point we'll realize that. But until then, you just keep going. And this has to do with your position in relation to other people's position. There are many groups and organizations who love to compare and say, I'm at this level of advancement and you're at that level. And it's important to not do that. That's judging, like we were saying.
And ego state.
Okay, so you say that the might not know who our teachers are. Do the teachers know who they are?
Yes,
They do,
yes,
even the more basic ones.
yes.
So they're teaching with intention.
But they're quite a bit more advanced than we are. That doesn't mean that we couldn't reach that level of the intermediate, some of the lower ones, within 2 or 3 lifetimes if we really, really put a concerted effort to it. Just keep in mind that in one particular lifetime, we can make good progress, but we can't, jump from here to there. It really takes time. Patience is the number one qualification or quality that we need to develop.
What's that?
Patience and contentment. Terry mentioned contentment earlier. That's also one of the niyamas, one of the rules of Raja Yoga. Contentment, and the Sanskrit word for that is santosha. The idea of being santosha.
The other one is persistence. Just one step after the other, and just never give up. Never. You can rest if you need to, but never lose track of where it is you're headed, and just keep going one step after the other.
And the Sanskrit word for that is tapas. That is your will, that your drive. Tapas, your effort, your actual will. And there's a key point with that as well. We walk that path with the grand plan in mind as well. Our steps that we take are in relation to the grand steps of the entire. So how is the planet evolving? How is humanity evolving as a whole? How's our solar system evolving? So we need to know that our steps work with the grand plan. Everything we do affects the whole. There's a great analogy. Think of an orchestra, an 80-piece orchestra with every single instrument is integral. If one violin is playing something funky, you notice, right? Even though 1 out of 80, 1/80th might not seem significant, but if you're in the audience listening, you'll know if someone hits a foul note, right? That's how life works too. And it's not as readily and quickly apparent because we're talking about scales that we can't even comprehend with our awareness. But it's like a grand symphony, the way the world works. And when we meditate, we get glimpses of how it works.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
4 o'clock. Let's just stay all night and talk.
So we're in the world, not of it, so to speak. And yet the world is before us, on the side of us, and back of us. It's in the moment we wake up with our spouse or with our friends. It is a continual being. So this is the work.
Mm-hmm.
This is the work.
I will say this though,
Yeah.
from when I was in my 20s to now, my ears are ringing.
Bird calling.
Wow. When I was in my 20s to now, and I'll be 72 quickly, the advancement of spirituality and consciousness toward enlightenment has been, in my experience, quick. More quick than when I was younger in my 20s with EST. Remember EST? Starting from that till my 30s and my 40s and my 50s, through marriage and family and through all of that, to me, it was like a little ball that started, and it started to race. To me, right now, I think it's very heightened, more than it was on a grand scale. Not the grandest scale, but on a pretty grand scale. People are becoming more conscious
It's
of.
very true.
Yeah.
The paradigm is shifting and the planet is shifting. People are becoming more.
It's
aware.
easy to get negative and say, oh, the world is getting worse. It's people, have forgotten their morals, et cetera, et cetera. But when you look at it carefully, it's not true.
Yeah.
There's less crime, there is less corruption, believe it or not. There are fewer people killed in massive wars, and the quality of life, the number of people who feel that they are happy and that they are content, all of the indications are that everything is getting better. It's moving forward.
I agree.
Well, I think we are in our right and perfect place. That's how I perceive it. On the other hand, because we're in a paradigm shift, it's topsy-turvy inside out, and people are like, what's going on? So for those of us that realize the bigger picture of it, we're like, this is good.
Remember too that there are quite a lot of people who don't want everything to be good. They thrive on the chaos and the commotion and the anger and the drama.
The ego.
They won't admit it, though.
Completely addicted to this drama of fighting about something.
No, we've been conditioned that way.
Well, some people really do enjoy it.
They
So,
do,
but
because it benefits greed a lot of the time.
it's up to the rest of us to just live our lives the way we do and to set a good example. And sooner or later, they catch on. It takes a long time and it's very frustrating, but they do catch on eventually.
We should wrap up.
Wrap up.
Let's wrap it up. All right, 4:05. Amazing. Thank you all for your participation.
Oh.
We had about 8 people
We'll see you next
online.
Question?
If anyone can't make a physical meeting here, these are being broadcast on Facebook Live and they're there on our page. And
So you can review them.
we are not going to have a second meeting in April. Terry and I are traveling and there's several things going on that we're doing, but the first Sunday in May we'll be back. First Sunday.
So this is it for April?
Unfortunately, yes.
You're going to come see us May 10th.
We have a date with you, yes.
Yes.
All right.
So can I just ask you a quick question, because I know we're leaving, but what is the position then on mediumship?
Well, our position is whatever you want it to. Have a position.
I'm just curious.
Explain, please, what you're asking, what you mean by mediumship.
Where do you hate it?
A medium?
Well, when you spoke about earlier about that there's no communication with the dead, and then you talked about there's a lot of people that say that they do have communication with